You would not recognize him in the portraits. The oil paintings hang today in a forgotten corner of a museum, where only the most curious visitors wander. They pass by quick-mildly intrigued by the man in armor, the faded banners, the distant cannons painted like stage scenery behind him. But no one pauses, because they do not know. They do not know that the man in the painting destroyed his country by doing nothing. Not betrayal. Not surrender. Not rebellion. What he did was far worse. He withheld victory. He stood on the edge of conquest. He had the war in his hands. But instead of claiming glory, instead of marching into the capital with laurels and fanfare, he gave the order that generals are never supposed to give. He told his soldiers to stop. And because of that one command, 100,000 men would die in the years to come. The empire would split. The king would go mad. And history would forget him and purpose. His name was General Aldrich Vey, and this is the story of how he became the most dangerous man in Europe because he refused to win. The war had gone on for 7 years. The official records call it the War of Succession, but everyone called it what it really was, the War of Greed disguised as duty. 2 princes, 1 dying king, a throne with no clear heir. And behind the curtain, 2 massive empires, and to the west, one to the north, each backing a different claimant. To the west, the kingdom of Oran, proud, sun-kissed, old. To the north, the Iron Confederacy, cold, calculating, industrial. Oran had chosen Prince Lucian, the king's favoured nephew, a man of poetry and pageantry. The Confederacy pushed for Prince Garrick, the king's bastard son, raised in secret, trained like a weapon. But beneath the royal banners and polished boots was a truth so simple it was offensive. Both sides wanted the ports, the silver, the grain, the tax routes. The war had nothing to do with birthrights. It was a feast, and the throne was the serving dish. Battlefront cut the continent in half. Towns turned into ash. Fathers and sons vanished into trenches. Entire villages became ghost maps. And in the centre of it all, standing like the unblinking eye of a storm, was Aldrich Vey. He never wanted to be a general. He was the second son of a minor duke in administrative mind, a scholar of military theory who had risen not by ambition, but by necessity. He had the rarest quality a commander can have. He told the truth. To everyone. Even when it made him hated. Even when it made him dangerous. They called him the Clockwork General. Not because he was emotionless, but because everything he touched moved with terrible precision. He had no flair. No speeches. No vanity. When the Confederacy first launched its northern campaign, they laughed at Oran's choice to place such a dull man in charge of the counter-strike. By winter, no one was laughing. Aldrich took back 3 fortresses in 4 weeks, using only smoke, mirrors, and starvation. He used rivers like knives. He studied the wind patterns of artillery smoke. He charted the migration of crowds to track the movement of corpses. Soldiers whispered that he could see time unfolding. His maps were nightmares drawn, not in roads and borders, but in contingencies. And he never lost. Not once. Which made what happened next all the more unthinkable. It was the 8th spring of the war. Aldrich had led the royal army to the edge of Marenth, the last stronghold of Prince Garrick. It was a city of stone and smoke-at-all, fortified, dug into the hillside like a claw. But Garrick was not there. That was the first sign. Aldrich's scouts confirmed it. The bastard prince had fled the city 2 nights before. Rumours swirled. Some said he was injured, others that had gone to seek reinforcements from the Confederacy. Either way, Marenth stood leaderless. The timing was divine. Aldrich had 47,000 troops. Marenth had less than 9,000 defenders, many of them wounded or starving. The gates were unmanned. The southern wall had collapsed in the last thunderstorm. It was over. Victory had never been this simple. Aldrich convened his officers at dawn. His captains expected orders for the assault. Instead, the general stood silent, staring at the map. One of them, a younger noble named Duren, broke the silence. "Sir," he said carefully, "we can end the war by nightfall." Aldrich nodded. "Yes. So we march." A long silence. Then, in a voice as cold as slate, "No, The officers didn't understand. They thought they'd misheard. Aldrich didn't repeat himself. He simply folded the map, turned his back, and walked away. The camp broke into chaos. Officers shouted. Messengers ran in circles. The troops waited in formation, armor baking under the rising sun, unsure why no trumpet sounded. And then the orders came down. Hold position. Do not advance. Do not engage. Some soldiers wept in confusion. Others raged. The enemy was defenseless. The war could be ended in hours. But instead, they were told to wait and watch and sleep with weapons unsheathed beside their beds. From the ramparts of Marenth, the enemy stared back. They too did not understand. No envoy was sent. No surrender demanded. Just a stillness thick with omen. The 6 days, the two armies faced each other, own crippled, the other frozen. On the 7th day, black smoke rose from the far hills. Confederacy reinforcements had arrived. The moment was gone. Aldrich had thrown away victory, and no one knew why. Not the king. Not the court. Not even Aldrich's closest lieutenants. His silence was a black mirror, and it terrified everyone who looked into it. The backlash was swift. He was summoned to the capital. The king demanded answers. Aldrich gave none. He stood in the marble war chamber while nobles shouted accusations. One accused him of treason. Another called him mad. The chancellor leaned forward and asked, in a voice heavy with exhaustion, why? Aldrich looked up, and in that moment, in that rare fracture of stillness, he finally spoke. His voice was quiet. Precise. If we win, he said, we lose everything. No one understood, and he did not explain. They could not execute him. He had not broken any law. He had followed orders. He had not retreated. He had not surrendered. He had simply not moved. And in war, indecision is not a crime. So instead, they erased him. His command was stripped. His name was omitted from records. His portraits were removed from war galleries. Even the soldiers who served under him were reassigned under new banners. Aldrich Vey disappeared. The war raged for 5 more years. In those 5 years, everything he feared came true. Prince Garrick survived. The Confederacy poured more men into the war. Garrick launched a scorched-earth campaign through the southern provinces. Fields were razed. Trade collapsed. The old king died without naming an heir. The capital burned during the riots, and in the end Oran won. But it was not a victory. It was a hollow groan of exhaustion. The throne passed to Prince Lucian, now old, sickly, and bitter. The treasury was empty. Half the nobility was dead or disgraced. The countryside lay in ruin. The ports were blockaded. And the people, what remained of them, no longer cheered for flags. They spat at them. Years passed. Then decades. No one remembered the clockwork general. Until a historian, one of those quiet souls who prefers libraries to living rooms, discovered a series of unsent letters in the archives beneath the city. They were written in Aldrich's hand. And they told the truth. I saw it coming like a hawk above the field, long before it struck. The problem was never Garrick, nor the Confederacy. It was us. Lucian would have won Marenth, yes, but the cost of peace under Lucian would have been empire, expansion, revenge. He would have married his daughter to the northern duchy, crushed the merchant class, turned the ports into military fortresses. Our sons would have gone to war again in 5 years, and again after that. Until we were no longer a kingdom, but a beast in steel feeding on the young to maintain its glory. I did not stop the war. I stopped the future. They think I hesitated. But no, I chose. I chose to bleed out the war rather than let it breed again. That was Aldrich's crime. He saw the next war. The one that comes after the victory feast. The one that begins not with cannon fire, but with parade drums. And he said no. He did not kill a king. He did not lose a battle. He simply refused to feed the cycle. And for that, he was erased. Not because he was wrong, but because he made them look at what they were becoming. There is a cruelty to memory, not the forgetting but the reshaping. Over time, Aldrich's name didn't vanish. It rotted, like fruit turned bitter in the mouth. The bards wrote him into ballads scoured, madman, traitor in brass armour. Mothers whispered his name to frighten stubborn children, eat your supper, or the still general will come. And in this capital, among the thin-lipped aristocracy who survived the war by watching others die, the phrase became a joke, don't weigh this up, to hesitate, to choke, to ruin a perfect opportunity by thinking too long. They spat his name like an error in calculation. But the deeper cruelty is this: they buried the wrong man. On the coast of what was once Oran, in a grey town forgotten even by its cartographers, a man with a crooked spine and a crooked smile taught arithmetic to fishermen's sons. He wore threadbare wool. His boots had no soles. He paid for bread with coin he cleaned nightly, but he carried, in the worn leather satchel slung over one shoulder, a folded piece of cloth once black, now sun-bleached, with a seal in wax long cracked and unreadable. No one knew his name. They called him Mr. Marrow, because of how little there was to him. But if you watched carefully, on certain mornings you'd see him by the shore, facing the sea, fingers moving in the air drawing invisible maps, tracing warpaths no child would understand. And his lips moved not in prayer, but in the dry whisper of formations, contingencies, wind speeds, supply routes. The war never left him, but he had left it, until the girl came. Her name was Ross, a bastard, a servant's child, but quick, too quick. She asked questions that should not be asked. She noticed things people weren't supposed to notice, and worst of all, she listened. Not like a child listens for praise, but like a spy, or a prophet, or a blade being sharpened. Mr. Marrow tried to ignore her. He taught her fractions, and she solved them before he finished writing. He gave her impossible problems, and she returned with impossible answers. She began asking about angles, then about velocity, then about how long it would take a rider to cross the flatlands at different gates if the roads were flooded. He stopped teaching her. So, she began watching him. She found the satchel, the seal, the maps, the medals. One night, she followed him to the shore and saw him move his hands again, sketching nothing into the wind. What happened at Maranth? She asked. The hands stopped. He did not turn. I don't know what you mean. You were there. A long silence. Then, I was everywhere. Why didn't you take the city? The wind stirred. And then he said something strange. Because I'd seen what cities become after they're taken. She kept asking. Every day. Not like a child. Like a courtier. A chronicler. A threat. And finally, when the frost came, and the waves no longer laughed against the rocks, he gave her a piece of paper. On it, only 2 lines. Victory is a currency, and I knew what they wanted to buy. The next day, he was gone. The satchel, the maps, the medals all left behind. Only his boots were missing. They found his body 2 days later, at the base of the cliffs, not broken, but at peace. Like a man who had finally emptied himself. They buried him beneath the rocks. No marker. No prayer. But Ross kept the maps. The words. Years passed. She grew. Not into a soldier, but into something worse. A writer. A quiet one, at first. She published under a false name. Her first pamphlet was banned. The second was burned. The third was copied in secret by students and whispered across academies like contraband scripture. Her thesis was dangerous. It said the war was prolonged deliberately. Victory was within grasp and was refused. At first, no one believed her. But she had documents. Letters. Raps. Eyewitness accounts. Discrepancies in troop movement. Weather logs that contradicted official records. And above all, she had the unbearable question, why didn't we win when we could? And suddenly, history cracked. Scholars began arguing. One camp said, Aldrich was a coward. He feared responsibility. He froze. He broke under pressure. The other said, he was a prophet. He saw the Empire's next shape and refused to carve it. Ross said neither. She said he was a mirror. That what terrified people most wasn't his failure but the possibility that he was right. Because if Aldrich Vey was right, if withholding victory had saved them from becoming monsters, then everything they celebrated was built on a mistake. Every medal, every parade, every statue, a monument to a war that should never have ended. And worse still, that every war since was a continuation of that silence. The chain reaction of victories that should not have been won. Her book was banned. But it didn't matter. It spread. Students read it by candlelight. Soldiers passed it in mess tents. Dissidents quoted it in code. And slowly, across the scattered remnants of the Empire, a single phrase took hold: win wisely or not at all. They whispered it like a prayer, or a threat, or a ghost's last command. But not everyone was pleased. The descendants of Lucian, now kings in name and coin, feared the book, not because of its claims but because of its logic. Because it gave people permission to question, to refuse, to ask why the blood never stopped flowing. And so they issued a decree. All records of Aldrich Vey were to be destroyed. Again. The second erasure. But history is a creature with teeth. You can bury the body. You can burn the name. But you cannot kill the idea. And Aldrich had become an idea. The general who refused to win. The man who saw beyond the battlefield. The whisper between every sword and its sheath. At the end of her life, Ross stood before a tribunal. Accused of sedition. Of falsifying history. Of endangering the peace. They asked her one question. Do you believe your general was right? She smiled. Not kindly. And said, I don't believe he was right. I believe he was necessary. In a city that no longer bore the name Oran, a monument was raised. Not in stone, not in bronze, but in silence. A ring of unmarked granite pillars, each one spaced exactly 20 paces apart, stood in a circle near the ruins of the old war chamber. No plaque. No dedication. No symbolism to be decoded. Just emptiness architected. Only those who had read Ross' book understood. And even they never spoke of it aloud. Because Aldrich's legacy was no longer in history books, it was in the quiet acts of refusal that began to appear in places power did not expect. It began with a commander on the eastern frontier. Her name was Elson Halve. Her orders were clear: suppress the insurrection, make an example of the rebels, burn the 3 villages that had sheltered them. But she did not. She arrived at the first village and ordered her troops to build wells. At the second she distributed grain. At the third she sat with the village elder, listened to him speak for 3 hours, and then offered his daughter a post in her officer corps. The capital was furious. They recalled her. Charged her with dereliction of duty. But before the trial could begin, the insurrection ended without violence. And when asked how she had managed it, she said, I let them win what they needed to live. So, they stopped needing to fight. The court had no words. A year later, in the hills of Austria, an entire garrison refused to open fire on a caravan of unlicensed traders. When questioned, the captain cited Aldrich's 3rd letter, which had never been published. It only passed hand to hand, copied in secret, memorized. Enforcement is not victory. Order is not peace. Sometimes, the most loyal act is disobedience. The garrison was disbanded. But the story spread. And then something stranger. A whisper. A rumor. That Aldrich had not died. That the body found on the cliffs was not his. That he had faked his death and vanished into the marshes of the southeast, where maps still ended in blank ink. There were sightings. A one-eyed man with a limp teaching logic to orphans. A beggar who could quote battle formations from wars no one remembered. A fisherman who vanished when asked about troop placement along the old ridgelines. Of course, they were lies. Except perhaps they weren't. The truth, after all, was never what Aldrich cared about. Only the pattern beneath it. What mattered was not the man. What mattered was what he interrupted. A single wedge thrown into the engine of glory. a crack in the tradition of endless war. And now, years later, that crack had widened. Universities debated military ethics for the first time in 3 generations. Young nobles quoted Ross instead of battle hymns. Peace, a true peace, without conquest, was being spoken of as a strategy, not a surrender. And beneath it all, like a second heartbeat, Aldrich's question lingered. What if the cost of victory is becoming what we hate? Not everyone agreed. There were still generals who called him a traitor. Still kings who spat at his name. Still historians who insisted the war would have ended faster, cleaner if he had taken Meren. And perhaps they were right. But no one could deny this. Aldrich Vey had changed how people thought about war. He had made victory feel heavy. He had made hesitation heroic. There was a letter, discovered years later in the ruins of the old royal archive, hidden behind a false panel. It was addressed not to a person but to whoever comes after. It read, "They will tell you I failed, that I blinked, that I broke under pressure. Let them. The truth is, I saw the face of the world they wanted to build, and I refused to hand them the bricks. Call that weakness if you must, but the strong do not always strike. Sometimes they withhold the blow, and sometimes that silence saves everything." The letter was unsigned, but the ink was Aldrich's. The angle of the script, the spacing of the lines, the choice to end not with a name but with a blank space. A pause. An invitation. To this day, no statue of Aldrich Vey has ever been raised. No anthem bears his name. But if you stand, just before dawn, on the southern hill of what was once Merinth, and look down at the valley where 2 armies once stared at each other in perfect stillness, you can still hear it. The absence. The order not given. The trumpet never blown. A silence so loud it split history. The men who write history rarely write about mercy. Mercy cannot be counted, cannot be engraved into a medal, cannot be marched past in a parade. It does not bleed. It does not crown. And yet, in the years that followed Aldrich Vey's refusal to win, mercy began to haunt the margins of imperial strategy like smoke curling under a sealed door. A new generation of soldiers raised on victory hymns and martial arithmetic found themselves paralyzed in the face of questions their instructors had not prepared them for. If I can win, should I? If I conquer, who inherits the ruin? If I survive by killing a stranger, who does not wish to fight, what part of me survives? They asked these things not in temples, but in trenches, not in salons, but at checkpoints. And always, always Aldrich's name returned, not shouted, not praised, but muttered. A warning. A permission. A mirror. Some called it the Vey Dilemma. Dilemma first appeared formally in the Royal Military Academy's Ethics Lecture Series, a compulsory course once considered irrelevant to real command. The professor, an aging veteran named Corlan Drev, delivered a lecture that year which would later be banned from circulation. He opened with a simple question. If your enemy lays down their sword and offers you their throat, and you take it, have you won a battle, or murdered a surrender? No one answered. So he told them a story. During the last siege of the war, a unit of young conscripts from the northern provinces was sent to storm a grain store protected by local farmers who had been conscripted in desperation. The farmers fled at the first sound of cavalry. The conscripts reached the granary. No resistance. Inside, they found food enough to feed 10,000. But instead of seizing it, they waited. They barricaded the doors. They posted a guard. They left a single message nailed to the door. This feeds mouths, not wars. When asked later why they disobeyed, their sergeant replied, "The war is hungry, but we were hungrier for something else." They were court-martialed. But their story survived. It was passed from barrack to barrack, until it appeared barely altered in one of Ross' later essays. And soon after, in graffiti on palace walls, "Feed the living. Starve the war." But even as Aldrich's legacy grew underground, power did what power always does, it adapted. Not by erasing him. Not this time. But by rebranding him. A statue was finally commissioned. So. Bronze. Idealized. Aldrich, atop a marble base, sword raised not lowered. His face youthful. His posture victorious. The inscription read, Aldrich Vey, first guardian of peace. But it was a lie. Everything about it was a lie. Because Aldrich never raised his sword, never claimed peace, never stood on marble. He walked away from glory, and that is why they feared him, not because he failed to win, but because he taught others to question what winning meant. Ross, still alive then now elderly and slow, her hands bent with ink and age, was asked to speak at the statue's unveiling. She refused. Instead, she sent a sealed letter. The letter was never read aloud, but a copy survived. It said, "You do not honor him. You overwrite him. He was not your sword. He was your stop sign, and you ran through him. Call him peace if it soothes your conscience. But peace is not silence, and he was not still, he was holding back a flood. Do not sculpt him into submission. Let him be what he was, the man who said no." The statue remained. But within a year, students had begun leaving flowers not at its feet but behind it. In the shadow, a quiet protest, a way of saying, "We remember the part you tried to hide." And each spring, they gathered, not to chant, not to march, but to sit in a circle, in silence. The 7 minutes, 1 minute for each year of the war that Aldrich tried to end. Then they left. No speeches, no slogans, just the weight of stillness. In time, these circles spread to other cities, to foreign countries, to places where the war had only been a rumor but where the idea had taken root. The idea that refusal could be an act of loyalty, that silence could be a command, that sometimes the greatest general is the one who disbands his army before the final blow. Power fought back. Universities lost funding. Public assemblies were banned. Several students were arrested for conspiracy to undermine martial cohesion. One of them, before being dragged away, shouted, "Then teach us not to think," and the silence that followed was worse than shouting, because it sounded like agreement. And so, quietly, the circles went underground. They met in basements, in abandoned train depots, in forests. They shared copies of Aldrich's letters, some now heavily fragmented, reconstructed from rumor and memory. They studied his battle maps not for their tactics, but for what they avoided. They asked, what wasn't attacked? War would have been seized, but wasn't. And in that negative space, they found ethics. A new philosophy was born. Not pacifism, not surrender, but strategic mercy. A code not of softness but of restraint. It did not say, "Do not fight." It said, "Know what you become when you win." They never found his bones. The official record says Aldrich died by falling from the cliffs near Elwyn's Cove. That his body was found 2 days later, half buried by the tide, eyes closed, hands still folded like a man asleep. That the undertaker never signed the death certificate, and the local priest confessed on his deathbed that the burial was a symbolic gesture. The truth, the body was too intact, too light, too clean. It was not him. Some say he escaped to the eastern marshes. Some say he became a monk, shaving his head and taking a vow of eternal silence in a hilltop monastery, whose name has since been erased from every registry. Some say he was killed in secret, not for treason but for the crime of denying glory to those who craved it most. And some say he still walks the borderlands, whispering maps to trees and teaching orphans how to calculate the price of a kingdom in lives. No one knows. And that's the point. Because the man was never the danger. The idea was. When Ross died, nearly 4 decades after Aldrich's vanishing, her funeral was small. Quiet. As Shed requested. No national honours. No procession. Just a plain box, a dozen students, and a note left behind. What he refused, I understood. What he withheld, I carried. What he foresaw, I watched come true. Do not turn us into saints. We were stop signs. You must be the brakes. Her papers were archived in a private university. And for years, no one read them. Then, slowly, in dark times when new wars loomed, when drums rolled again and children were taught to chant in meter, those old letters returned. In one of her final interviews, Ross was asked if she had ever regretted publishing Aldrich's letters, if she had ever felt responsible for the way soldiers had used his words to resist, to disobey, even to desert. Her reply was quiet, surgical. We have never lacked men who know how to pull the trigger. We have always lacked men who know when not to. That quote now hangs above the entrance of a certain school. Not a military academy. Not a university. Just a school. Where children learn not only how nations rise but why they fall. Where the names of kings are footnotes, and the maps show not battle lines, but harvest routes and refugee flows. Where students are taught Aldrich's war, not as a story of loss or triumph but as a choice. And the final exam asks just one question. You are at the gates of a city. Your army is ready. The enemy is weak. History is watching. What do you do? No answer is correct. Only the reasoning matters. Aldrich never gave his reasoning. Not in full. But in one of the last fragments recovered written in faded charcoal on the back of a war ledger he left something that historians still argue over. It read, "They asked me why I did take the city. They never asked what would have happened if I had. That is the question that keeps me from sleeping. Not what I did, what I prevented. And maybe that is the point. Maybe we remember him not because of the path he walked, but because of the one he blocked. The one that led to something darker, something bloodier, something familiar. Look around. Look at the monuments, the parades, the names carved into stone. Then look for the ones missing. The silences, the absences, the statues that were never built. And listen closely. Not to the trumpets, but to the places they never played, the cities that were never stormed, the gates that stayed closed, the valleys where two armies once stood still and then went home. That, too, is history. That, too, is war. The war that could have been. The victory that never came. And the general who refused to win so that the rest of US might remember what winning costs.